Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. A lot of things have been coming out after the Charlie Kirk assassination. Obviously, we've seen continued leftist violence, but even in the face of this violence, many people have said that it's not okay to call for justice or even vengeance for Charlie Kirk. They say, no, you're a Christian. You have to forgive, you have to move on. There's nothing you're allowed to do, nothing you're allowed to go out and say, nothing you're allowed to advocate on behalf of, because ultimately forgiveness has to be what you're centered on. But that's not really a reflection of what Christian society has said about justice, what the Bible says about justice, and the role that the government plays in this process. Oftentimes we entirely conflate the role of the government and the role of the individual when it comes to forgiveness and justice. Talking to me today about this is one of the guys over at American Reformer. He wrote a great article on this topic. Timon Cline, thanks for coming on, man.
Thanks so much for having me again, Auron. Always good to be with you.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to dive into the biblical case for public vengeance. But before we get started, let's hear from today's sponsor. Everyone knows that college is a major investment, so it's really important to do your research. You want to find a school that shares your values, but who has the time to dig through all those college websites? Well, today I've got great news for you. There's a free, easy-to-use resource that does the work for you. It's called ChristianCollegeGuide.com. This online directory of over 250 Christian colleges and universities is a one-stop shop. ChristianCollegeGuide.com lists all the basics such as acceptance rates, tuition costs, and academic majors. But here's what makes this resource truly special. ChristianCollegeGuide.com will show you the school's faith commitments, its campus policies, and its spiritual life. All the info that you will need to find the college you can trust. This is the definitive college guide for Christian higher education, and it's completely free. So if you or someone you know is considering college, go to ChristianCollegeGuide.com to create a free user profile and start today. It's ChristianCollegeGuide.com. All right, Timon, like I said, we've talked, of course, on the show about the practical political realities, why you have to punish the left, why it's not okay to just let this slide in general. I think a lot of people, of course, would say you need to punish the murderer of Charlie Kirk. I think that's pretty obvious to everyone why the public magistrate would punish the murderer and then Erica Kirk can choose to forgive or not as a private citizen. However, a lot of us have, I think, correctly pointed out that there needs to be a wider scope of this kind of pushback. It's not enough to simply punish the one person who pulled the trigger. And a lot of people have had big problems with that. I even got attacked by Reason Magazine as an incredibly dangerous figure for pointing out that if there is no public vengeance, if there is no wider understanding applied by the government of how we should conduct ourselves in moments like this, we're going to see more of this. And I think you laid this out very well in your piece at American Reformer. Can you give us a little bit of just a basic framework? Why do we need to understand the role of public private forgiveness and public vengeance differently?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just say everything appears dangerous to Reason Magazine, and you should consider it a badge of honor that they find you dangerous. In any case, right? So the dichotomy was kind of set up publicly during even as early as Charlie Kirk's memorial service between Erica and her, personal forgiveness of the killer, even unrequested by the killer, but she offered it anyway. And then Trump saying, "I don't forgive my enemies," and obviously I think there's a good argument that was partly tongue in cheek, but there's also something serious about it given his position. And I think that apparent dichotomy or apparent conflict followed by people, as you were noting, generally speaking, saying, as Christians, we should be calling for the forgiveness and maybe clemency of people who do wrong. And of course, at bare minimum, you have to take the Mike Pence route, which is to limit all the causality and all the damage to this one individual case, this one person. I think he said, one person killed Charlie Kirk. We're not going to put America on trial. That was kind of his line after this. And among other things, what's confused in all this is the distinction, very, the traditional kind of distinction between public and private persons. These are different things. Public persons are representative of others. They have authority. They have sovereignty. However they get it doesn't matter at this point. The point is they're different than private people are. And so there is actually, in many ways, a different ethic that public figures have to embody in order to perform their duties as public persons. So this basic distinction being absent from a lot of the conversation created a lot of confusion, and we can unpack it more, but I think that's the most basic point we have to start with.
No, again, very important. As you say, your role as a magistrate is not the same as a private individual, and you go into this in the piece that ultimately the magistrate is taking on certain tasks. He has to commit certain acts that otherwise people would shy away from. And this is something that I think a lot of people miss in our discussions about public officials, right? We want someone who's just competent. We want someone who just has the right managerial skills. But actually, statecraft is not just a set of managerial skills. It's not the ability to more efficiently run a bureaucracy or apply government policy. It's about making critical decisions and taking on responsibilities that other people would not. Joseph de Maistre called this decisionism, right? That you have this duty to act when others would not, to bear the weight of responsibility when others would not. And in many ways, he says the executioner is kind of a cog between the authority of the prince, the authority of the king, and the people. It's this thing that binds them together and cements the authority that God has instantiated in that system. And if you don't properly exercise that authority, if you leave it on the wayside, then order breaks down, because if people do not see the magistrate applying that form of public vengeance, they will seek private vengeance. And so when we think about the Christian ethic, it's not that there's a lack of justice or even a lack of vengeance, but it's a transferal of the authority from the private vengeance on the private enemy to the magistrate's public vengeance on the enemy that has wronged the public.
Yeah, and I think you can see right away a difference between the public and private person, the magistrate and the citizen. A difference in the way they're supposed to behave and what they're allowed to do, because clearly the injunction against murder in the Sixth Commandment does not in some way apply to the civil authority. He is allowed to take life, right? So clearly there's a difference in what we are. And then there's a difference in purpose of our actions and what they're supposed to be oriented to. And so we're precluded from taking private vengeance for people who wrong us in a private way. The Bible is very clear on this. We are supposed to forgive. We are supposed to be long-suffering. We're supposed to have our sort of consciousness of actions even against us understood in light of eternity and in providence and so on and so forth. But the public man, the magistrate, the one who has authority, is supposed to have a very different perspective on these things, especially threats against his citizens, threats to disorder, violence, so on and so forth. And this is all part of his duty of rewarding good and punishing evil, of keeping order, of reflecting God on earth, of being God on earth. So vengeance is the Lord's for all wrong in eternity. It's also belongs to inside of time, temporally, for the sake of God's purposes, to the magistrate, the one who's been given authority to do this. And to your point about competence, I mean, yes, this is how we think about our elected officials and these things now. If you read older theologians like a Heinrich Bullinger, who I cite in the piece, the first qualification of a magistrate that he lists before anything else is not competency. It's to have sort of the ability, the power, and what he calls a princely stomach to do these things that private people don't want to do and don't have to do, right? And one of those is to execute justice on wrongdoers, both for the safety of your people, but also as an expression of God's justice and his righteous anger, and more functionally to limit what we call like copycats. If you don't punish sin, if you don't publish crime rigidly, you will suggest that people can get away with it. You will multiply the violence. You will multiply the crimes, which seems pretty intuitive. But this is something that many authors would walk through to sort of explain why you actually have to have this vengeance exercised regularly and forcefully, and laws upheld so that you don't degrade their authority.
So one of the things that I think is really critical as well is that you talk again about going beyond just the original shooter, like you said, Mike Pence, and okay, we're not putting the whole country on trial. But you point out that incitement is itself a form of public disorder, that this is
Yes.
going to create more violence, that this is designed, that's why we call it incitement, designed specifically to end in additional violence, that different additional crimes against the state, against the magistrate. And so, therefore, it's not simply enough to punish just the individual who did the crime if there are those around them that are building up a system, building up a call, building up a reward ultimately for committing the crime in the first place. And I think this is what some people got worried about, right? Because we're saying, okay, it's not enough to just stop at this shooter. Like, yes, the shooter should be punished, but we have people who are openly calling for violence. We have people who are repeatedly funding organizations that are enabling violence. And this needs to be the wider scope of what's going on here. The Trump administration has already promised to go after NGOs, to go after Antifa, to designate it as a foreign terrorist organization, to start breaking up its cells. We've seen some arrests at the site of crimes when it comes to ICE agents being assaulted, blocked, this kind of thing. But we have not seen a wider campaign of striking at the heart of this terror network that is encouraging these attacks. Can you explain why biblically it is all right to move to these moments of incitement, to move to these organizations that, while they may not be pulling the trigger, are creating an environment, creating an incentive structure, and enabling the violence itself?
Yeah, I think the Bible and Christian theology are both are both realistic about how these things work, right? And that culpability is not limited to the sort of final action. The anything that is traditional commentary on the Sixth Commandment itself would say, if you are inciting this, if you're encouraging it, if you're preying upon especially weak people who will take you up on it foolishly, if you're creating the kind of environment where it's foreseeable and that this is going to emerge, especially against like specified targets, it's one thing to just, I don't think most people would take an argument that's just like, you just go outside and somehow be violent, just a general encouragement. But we've seen, I give this thinly veiled hypothetical of like, what if you were a journalist who for the past like 10 years has every day been going out and joining your other journalist friends to declare so-and-so Satan, and then to justify that Satan, of course, can be resisted by violence, even lethal force. And you do this over and over and over again until people take you up on it. You have culpability in this. And this is what we've seen from our journalistic class for a decade at this point, since, 2015, 2016. And then, of course, what you're referring to is even more culpable, not just the encouragement, but the mechanized and organized enabling and provisions for this kind of violence. So it's the encouraging sort of propagandistic side, but then it's also, providing the munitions, we might say, certainly culpable in this regard. And so therefore, this culpability should be met with public vengeance. Again, not private vigilante justice. In fact, that's what we're trying to discourage and punish in this regard. But with public vengeance, and it's perfectly justified, in fact, good for Christians to be enemies of disorder and corruption and so on and so forth, to encourage the magistrate to call on him to exercise public vengeance on these things.
So I think the word vengeance is one that's going to give a lot of people pause in this, right?
Yep.
They might say, well, I don't mind justice or deterrence, maybe even, right? Like maybe they say, well, I understand why we might need to execute the bad guy to deter further crimes, right? But the word vengeance for a lot of people, that sounds hateful. That sounds, the retributive justice is the problem,
Mm-hmm.
right? That ultimately we should only be deterring and we should never have retribution. But I think that aspect is important because, as you say, these crimes do call out for vengeance. There is ultimately a recognition that justice means vengeance at some level. And so if there is not the understanding that you are ultimately making right some aspect of this crime, that the proper wage is being paid, then I think we do miss something as a society. That doesn't mean that we are reveling in a violence or torture or these things, but recognizing, as I think you point out in the piece, that clemency itself is a crime against the victim if it's done by the magistrate without any justice. The clemency there is something that is giving them an opportunity to pull back perhaps excesses of vengeance, but that does not mean that we should not in general have this vengeance, because if you don't have it, as you're pointing out, if the state will not take its role in this moment, then the average person will, because just the laws of nature will drive them towards this end if they do not see it meted out by the state.
Yeah, that's right. I'll briefly say, then circle back to the point of retribution, but there's a sense in which a inattentive secular authority that is not, it is tempting people to take matters into their own hands, right? And this itself you would be culpable for. There's a great article from Henry Cabot Lodge, way back in the early 20th century, about a vigilante lynching of Italian immigrants that takes place in Louisiana because they suspect them of being in the mafia. And he says, obviously, this cannot be condoned and these people should be punished, but this is Congress's fault for their immigration policy. They've created the conditions where people will do this, and it's totally foreseeable, and it's on you guys, right? So it's a perfectly reasonable way to work this out and think about it. So if an inattentive or a weak government paves the way for this kind of thing, and this is what you want to avoid. This is what a just government should avoid. On the question of like retribution, vengeance, I mean, these are just words we're uncomfortable with, I suppose, but all law is coercive. This is the point. It's an obligation backed by punishment. This is how you keep order. And then the punishment can't just be mere deterrence or threat if it's never if it's never doled out. You have to actually punish people for violations. And this is part of the deterrence. It's most effective deterrence. Otherwise, it's all toothless. So this is just the nature of law and secular authority. And it is retribution on behalf of the whole when these things are broken, when public order is abused. So this is just what we're doing all the time, or should be doing, if we actually uphold our laws. So this is not a strange thing. And especially heinous acts, right? We're not talking about like speeding fines, but heinous acts of violence, public assassinations, political assassinations should be met with retribution and vengeance on behalf of the whole. I just think that's unavoidable and proper. And then you're right. I have a discussion. We can talk more about it of clemency. Of course, this is like, leniency with a sentence when the letter of the law would say you have to execute them or something. And the magistrate judges can use this at their discretion. It's theirs. But the proper way to exercise it is if equity or if justice calls for a commuted sentence, that the letter of the law somehow doesn't fit the scenario perfectly, and justice actually would be to forego sentencing. When this is not the case, it is wrong to do so, to exercise clemency in sort of a gratuitous way, in a weak way. And it doesn't promote the public good, and it doesn't pursue equity. And in most cases, the law has already been formulated to provide temperance. That's its point in this regard, and order, and it should be followed. And there's no question in the case of public assassinations whether or not this is legal or illegal. So this is not a case of clemency. Neither is it the case that abusing public trust with evil NGOs and slush funds and all these sorts of things is in any way legal or appropriate to the ends that these kind of carve-outs were provided. So those also should not be provided clemency.
You also discuss the importance of particularly violence against public figures that are part of the state, hold official office, or otherwise represent the body politic in a larger way, and the importance that those must be punished, and they must be punished severely. Can you talk a little bit about why? I mean, I think a lot of people just say, oh, well, of course the politicians will want to, punish anybody who hurts them. That's going to be their first priority. But you make a case that this is actually critical for the common good as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the public violence, meaning not just that it's done publicly like everyone sees it, but violence against public figures who are representative figures who constitute like a compound or public moral person. They're more than just themselves because of either their position or they're following these sorts of things. They matter to the Commonwealth in a different way. And so this is more acutely an act against the whole country, not just one private individual, like they have a disagreement, over who owes whom money or something. This is an attack on the entire nation, the entire Commonwealth. And so it must be met with particular retribution for that purpose. And we even treat murders generally this way. This is why murder cases are not handled through private suit or civil suit. You actually are not in charge of the prosecution. It's the victim or the family of the victim. You're not in charge with the prosecution. The state conducts that on behalf of the whole, because all murders are considered to be a crime against the society, not just against the individual. So we already do this and already understand this. And it's even more the case when that person, and I think everyone intuitively knows this, the way they mourn about it, the way they understand something big has happened. And throughout the history of any, assassinations of public figures in America, this is obviously the case. It means something different, and for good reason.
And you also discuss the importance of the magistrate to seem severe, even cruel, which, again, I think a lot of people would be very scared of that language. But I really want to emphasize this point, because I don't think we focus on it enough. It is that ability to justly apply that capacity, which is so rare and what makes leaders valuable. So can you talk a little bit about why it would be okay for a Christian leader to appeal cruel, or why it might even be necessary?
Yeah, I have this commentary that's drawing from various theologians, but the general idea is, like, most people actually would advocate, and maybe this is counterintuitive, but it would advocate leniency against criminals. Why? Because they're thinking of themselves, of what if that was me, I would want the leniency. So they're not generally capable of actually doling out punishment or real justice in this way. At the same time, they can be intemperate, like in their anger, and do, mob violence is an expression of this. The good ruler has to have control and has to be able to chart the middle course that is neither too lenient nor disproportionate in its punishment. But these things will, this exercise of just severity, we might call it, is going to appear cruel to the common person, because it is cruel, it is shocking, and it's meant to be. As a public figure representing, the retribution of God and the whole Commonwealth, it has to be this way, and the private man is just incapable of doing this. And most of our, today, most of our rulers are incapable of doing this, but this is supposed to be part of their natural criteria. And this is why they are where they are and we're not, ideally speaking. So yes, the magistrate, in exercising justice for these types of crimes, has to be willing to be thought extremely cruel. And in fact, in a sense, he is being very severe and cruel in that way, but it's for the distinguishing factor is it for just cause or not? Is it for the public good or not?
Interestingly, I think that most of our civil magistrates have lost this ability, right? This is something that we select against these days. And you can tell because we desperately avoid at all costs basically applying the death penalty. We still technically have it on the books, but it's going to take the most heinous crime you can imagine and like 30 years of sitting on death row before you finally actually have any of this happen. So the idea of any kind of timely justice, actual public vengeance for the most severe crimes is actually pretty non-existent in our current paradigm. We can talk a little bit about the death penalty. Let's talk about that first, but also a wider understanding of corporal punishments. Do you think that, well, I guess we'll start with the death penalty. We have a lot of people, even especially actually the Catholic Church, saying that this is not Christian, that we should not have the death penalty. So can you first make a case for the death penalty as a Christian, I guess, ultimately, and its swift application, not a 30-year infinite appeal process?
Well, this is a point I make in the piece, is actually if you're unwilling to appear to be cruel and to be severe, you end up being cruel in an unjust way. Not only is mercy to the guilty unmercy to the innocent, but also it lends itself, when you don't have swift and severe justice, to things like you're talking about, which I would say it's demonstrably more cruel to have people sitting on death row for 30 years than it is to execute the death penalty. I just think this is an inhuman way to sort of house people. And it has all sort of bad externalities. And so I would say it's actually, we've arrived through our misplaced leniency and mercy at crueler punishments and a crueler state of living than otherwise would have been the case, because we don't have the stomach to actually do what's necessary and appear cruel and severe. Yes, I heard, many people from a supposed Christian perspective saying that the death penalty is I guess just wrong. It offends their sensibilities is what they're really saying. But this is, certainly contrary to Christian tradition. Capital punishment has been upheld over and over again throughout the Western civilization, which is to say Christian civilization, and has been exercised in, all Western countries until, historically speaking, fairly recently. And of course, it's in the Bible, the only time the image of God, that phrase that like all evangelicals love to throw around as a sort of comprehensive ethic, is ever mentioned is in the context of justifying capital punishment. And the reason it's justified is it is in this sense, when you are destroying the image of God in man, you are attacking God himself. You are playing God. You are deciding when and where life will be ended in place of the Creator. So, as the actual God on earth, the magistrate should behave. This should be the most severely punished crime. It's the most universally recognized as according to the natural law, as being disallowed and awful, or whatever you want to say about it, and that's for a good reason. Also, it's sort of encoded into nature, into our being. Self-preservation being sort of the first law of nature is the contrast of this. Self-defense, flows from that. So obviously, the magistrate should take this with the utmost seriousness. It should never be tolerated. It should never be offered clemency. Right. There's all sorts of, edge cases you can come up with, of course, and this is not speaking to adjudication of these crimes, to have demonstrable proof and, do your best to make sure you don't falsely accuse innocent people. But in the main, and in the case we're talking about, I think there's no room within Scripture or the Christian tradition to say that this would somehow be unwarranted or inhumane to do so. In fact, the opposite's the case.
Now, obviously, this is currently two Protestants, throwing stuff over the fence here. But
as it should be, yes.
But since we are the foundation of this, fine land, we will
yes.
do so at our leisure. So, why do you think? Because this is what I hear all the time from Catholics, right? And there's a lot about the Catholic Church that I respect, but this is always a difficult one for me. They always tell me, well, it doesn't matter if you get a bad pope, because ultimately, the doctrine of the church persists, right? Like that, we never change the doctrine, and that's what continues to be stalwart in the face of any given leader. And I'm sympathetic to that case. I've made the case many times. What if you get a bad king, and then you have all these horrible democratically elected politicians that are worse than any king you could ever imagine? But when you look at the Pope here and what has become Catholic teaching, it becomes clear that the death penalty is basically forbidden at this point under Catholic doctrine. But if I read the Bible, if I look at Christian tradition, none of that seems to be the case. Why has this shifted over time? And obviously, I'm not going to make you make the case for papal authority, but why has this shifted over time when it's supposed to be that bad popes don't shift Christian doctrine under the Catholic Church? Why do they keep moving this direction?
Yeah, and our Catholic friends, those of them in the trenches with us, I'm sure will have their own objections to this, and they always have very clever, smart ways of interpreting these problems and solving them for themselves. I'll leave that to them. It's apparent to me that certainly the string of popes since we've been alive, but I would say in the modern era, have increasingly ticked towards basically the baptism of liberal sensibilities, as the rest of the world calls on it to be so. What the motivation is for that, I'm not sure, but it's coming externally onto the church in terms of its tradition, rather than internally being generated, as far as I can tell. And so these kinds of things, like the same adoption by the papacy, for all intents and purposes, of like climate change dogma, and the same kind of talking points on migration, all these things. You do not find these kind of concerns or practices in the high medieval church. You don't find aversion to capital punishment in the high medieval church. This is just not, where all the tradcasts would like to land. This stuff is not there. And I'm sure they recognize that. And that's part of why they they think the way they do. So it would seem to me it's a foreign incursion into the Roman Catholic Church, but that has nevertheless been adopted or approved by its leadership. And I don't understand, as a Roman Catholic, how you're not forced to either embrace it and adopt it based on your own ecclesiology, or go elsewhere. It's a conundrum for them to figure out, but I certainly wouldn't be able to stomach it.
Yeah, I mean, the dodge you always get is like, well, the Pope wasn't speaking ex cathedra, right? I think that's what they call it when he's speaking with
Right.
the official weight of a divine authority. And that, okay, I can take that, for some of this, but I'm pretty sure when it comes to death penalty, they have spoken ex
Yes.
cathedra on this. And so it seems like their dictate is in direct violation of Christian tradition and biblical law. And so, yeah, that's
And we would say of apostolic law, right? What about the case of Ananias and Sapphira, where we would say the Roman reading of this is that Saint Peter himself, and of course he does actually do this, but I mean the political theological import, commits executes two members of the church for their theft. Okay, so the Saint Peter, exercises capital punishment, and so in the lineage, the apostolic lineage, it would seem that this can't be changed. This is something that a power the apostles exercised.
Yeah, no, good point. Well, I think that covers mainly what you covered in your article, but I also want to talk about the larger reaction in a Christian sense, because one of the most interesting things about Charlie Kirk's memorial service, and a lot of people, it's flashy, it's loud, there's guitar music, there's pyrotechnics. I get all that. The aesthetics aside, this was a situation where basically every major leader of the Republican Party, the Trump administration, these people came out, and the vast majority of them focused their discussions on Christ, right? Like everyone from Rubio to Vance to Tucker Carlson, public officials, public voices, commentators, all these things. Every one of them, almost to a man, comes out and discusses the importance of Christianity in this instance. And of course, we're used to presidents sneaking in "God bless America" at the end of a speech, or when it's really convenient, saying Barack Obama saying, well, the scriptures tell us something, and then completely. But this was the first time I had seen that level of kind of Christianity on public display. And that's weird because I'm getting old, so I remember I remember the late 80s and early 90s to some degree. And even then, I don't remember there being, even when the religious majority, the moral majority, was a real active force in politics, I don't remember ever seeing a public event with that outpouring of Christian faith. And not just that it was, mentioned, not just in the sense that God bless our country and pray for these things, but, God should be guiding our response to this. We should be embracing a Christian faith. Of course, many of them were doing this because it was so important to Charlie Kirk and they wanted to honor him. But still, I think that level of open Christian acknowledgement and imbuing it into the rationality, that we are following a Christian ethic and a Christian logic and how we should respond to this. I think that was a really important moment for the country. What do you think?
No, I mean, you're only slightly older than I am, Auron, and so you have a little more memory than I do. But I think everyone would have to admit this, even people that hated it, that we haven't seen anything like that from not just one public official, but sort of essentially all the major ones. The cabinet is there basically. Doing the same thing over and over. Some were better than others. Obviously, Marco Rubio stood out. JD Vance, even later when he's hosting Charlie Kirk's show, that stood out, where he's reciting the Nicene Creed and so on and so forth. So I've never seen anything like it, and I do think it marks a change in the cultural dynamics. You could say, this is how I think of it. It's sort of the actual immersion for the first time of the culture wars. Because this only works when only one side is sort of appropriately responding to cultural dynamics. It's a one-sided conflict, and the right's never really pushing back with equal force according to their contrary position and convictions and things, you don't really have a war. You have some, basically you're being bullied the whole time. And we had, of course, everyone remembers like culture warriors, Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell and these, and they were in some ways ahead of their time in a lot of what they recognized and a lot of what they did, but they didn't have this force. They didn't have real power behind them, and they were sort of marginalized. This to me marks something very different, where there really is two diametrically opposed positions on display between the left and the right actually has the ability at least to exercise power, not just of the actual government power itself, but of persuasion, of vying for the laws of fashion and of public morality. And that's what those speeches did. They signaled, we think this is good. Maybe some of us are up here for Charlie. Maybe some of us really believe it, but we think this is good. And it's actually something we're going to get behind, and we're going to put our own reputations on the line, along with it. So totally changed, I think, overnight, the cultural dynamics and what we're actually seeing. I would say for now is the first time you actually have a two-sided culture war that are sort of in many ways equally matched, right? For the first time, you both are able to wield certain forms of real power.
The term Christian nationalism has been bandied around, and I have my own problems with the term just from a tactical sense. But ultimately, is this not really the embrace of actual Christian nationalism in the sense that this is now, again, I think it's a big shift between, Christianity is this thing that we adorn our speeches with because it kind of harkens back to this thing we know we should probably be talking about. We'll slip it into a speech somewhere, as opposed to like, no, this is the justification and logic for our actions. Like, we are following the Christian teachings on this. That is the tradition. That is, the epistemology that brings us to our conclusions. We are following this because that is the natural way that we should reason through or arrive at these decisions collectively. And a lot of the left, of course, did, we get the everything's a Nazi rally. It's we hear this all the time. But I do really think that underlying logical shift is important, because even as you say, if some people up there are just saying that because, okay, well, this is what Charlie would have wanted, and so that's, he would have approved this, we'll talk about it this way. I think that starts to seep its way into the operations of many politicians. And in a way, what you were seeing with the Trump administration up there was an insurgent movement inside the GOP itself. That's always been true. Of course, MAGA has always been, kind of pushing against the established GOP. But I don't think you would have seen even the most Christian, quote unquote, politicians. You wouldn't have seen a Mike Pence that talks about, he will talk about his faith, but I don't think you would have had him explaining how it informs the civic, understanding of how we should take action. And that, I think, really creates a split, not just in the left-right divide, not just a culture war across left and right, but perhaps even a revolution inside of the right, inside of conservatism, of how we should address these issues, by what logic we should take actions and create justifications. And that informing everybody, from staffers all the way up to cabinet members, I think has a very, very important impact. We probably won't see in 3 years or 5 years, but generationally, it will have a big impact on the way that the right organizes and sees itself inside of institutions.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, yes, MAGA was always first and foremost a GOP coup, but this has been contentious and sort of questionable what the outcome would be for years now, right? And I actually think this moment, it totally solidified. It established, here's what the MAGA base is, kind of again, or anew, right? These are the people that were most publicly identified with, their way of life, their general convictions, their understanding of the American tradition and history, their way of wanting to conduct themselves publicly. This is what we're going to be about. You don't, for the other factions or pieces of MAGA as a coalition, they have not had similar representation in this way. Of course, this was out of their hands. This is just an event that happened. This is in the hands of Providence. But I'm just saying this because it did happen. This is an obvious shift on the right as a point of orientation, or what's going to be magnetic, what's going to sort of drive the boat in this way. So I think that's absolutely the case, and as many people online were saying, this is it. Christian nationalism won. I think there's a good reason to say that, insofar as the right, and you see it with people who are not Christians on the right, but still are kind of joined in on this and recognize that it's a good thing, or at least a powerful thing. So they're following the strong horse. The recognition that in the American sort of populist style, this is a Christian nation, and that means we do Christian things publicly, and we sort of center this. That certainly is what won in that regard on the right, I think. And that will continue to manifest going forward. I was, of course, worried that it's like, is this going to be something real, or is this just a moment and everyone sort of put on the Christian hat to do it? But I think it is real. I mean, things that have happened since then, that have continued that kind of energy, or it's still going. I don't think it's going away anytime soon, and we should make sure that it doesn't. The left loves to make use of their most despicable kind of martyrs. We shouldn't be ashamed of making constant reference to and maintaining the memory of a objectively good martyr on our side, for the same purposes. So if that's what motivates people, that's great. If the moment or the general energy itself does, that's great. But I do think it's changed something. And you see people, even like when the vice president says, Charlie inspired me to be more bold about talking about Jesus, I think something's changed, right?
Yeah, that's right. Well, and I was just, that dovetails well into my next question. When I had Nick Land and Alexander Dugan on, both men who were accused of Satanism recently, they both made
and you were probably accused of Satanism by
well, it's Tuesday, but mostly by people who aren't Christian. Funny enough, if you've written a book about how much you hate Christianity and then you called me a Satanist, that's really fun. But the interesting thing at the end of that interview is, I tried to address those issues head on a little bit, since they had mentioned on Tucker Carlson. And both men said that, look, we wouldn't agree with any of these characterizations, especially Dugan. He's an Orthodox Christian. But the point is the fact that discussions about spirituality are back in the political mainstream is huge, right? The fact that people will talk about, hey, that's demonic. They're behaving in a demonic way. This is clearly evil, that we need to be concerned about evil forces in our politics. The fact that we are simply injecting the spiritual as if it is another valid way to recognize our world is critical, because obviously previously the rule of rationality was everything. You weren't allowed to acknowledge spiritual realities, spiritual forces, the metaphysical, the transcendent. If you brought any of those things into a mainstream political discussion or even a philosophical discussion, you get laughed out of the room. It can't impact your law, any of these things. Now it feels like something has really shifted, right? And it's part of it is, of course, is just how evil, the level of evil around us is too pervasive. It's too obvious to simply shrug off and say, oh, well, probably just kooky. But also it's the fact that we are allowed to once again reach to that part, the other side of reality, right? So long we have denied these transcendent truths, these spiritual realities, because we knew that we would get these weird looks. And now that is burst through. And I think we could feel that again with Charlie Kirk, right? Like, you look at the assassination of this man and that Satan's real. Like that has to be real. You can't look at these people, celebrating the death of this man in front of his young children who still don't understand he's dead at that point. Like, it doesn't even register to them. They're that young, where like the permanence of his death simply does not fire in their neurons, right? Like, the fact that is something you could celebrate as a human being, it's hard not to look at that and not say, okay, that is a spiritual evil acting on an individual, right? That you can't just say mental illness or these things. They are no longer sufficient explanations for what we're staring at. And so in a really interesting sense, I think the return of this Christian nationalism, this, whether we want to use that phrase or not, this public acknowledgement of spiritual forces and Christian truth, I think this comes in the light of just a general understanding that we must re-engage with the spiritual, that it's no longer enough to just pretend that science and logic and reason govern us, that there is another realm, there is another reality, And those things are manifesting themselves in real life, whether we want to acknowledge them or not.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think it's worth appreciating that we wouldn't have this change or this moment probably if it weren't for the reactions. For this very point, the contrast you're pointing out, right? If evil is like negation of the good, you have to see that negation to sort of believe it and understand it, that it's there. And so I think it wasn't just that Charlie Kirk was shot; it was that you had the type of reaction from the left that you did. That was celebrating it, that was justifying it, that was looking for ways to perpetuate it, not just in sort of people that were easily dismissed, but in people that you can't say that they're mentally deranged or crazy because you've just invalidated like the entire credentialing system on your side, right? If someone, you can't say this about Jimmy Kimmel or other people. They have to be totally competent and smart and morally true and in control of their faculties. So then you're met with there's not good explanations. It has to be that something evil is happening. There's something transcendent going on. This is too bizarre, too shocking, that people would actually celebrate this against their own ostensible principles, right? And even saw some people on the left like wrestling with this in real time of like, I didn't think we were about this. It's like, no, you are. This is what your crowd is about. And the fact that it would not have had the same effect. It would have different effects, but not the same if it had been Donald Trump. Right. The fact that it's Charlie Kirk and that even people who disliked him couldn't deny this sort of Christian Boy Scout quality about him. Right. And playing by all the rules you're supposed to play, in sort of civil society, still playing that game with everyone. And so for him to be killed and then for the reaction to be what it was from the left, I think created an entirely different moment than it otherwise would have been, where people are left with in the face of this kind of evil. And sort of mocking evil to only arrive at certain spiritual conclusions, if they weren't already. I mean, this is the same effect as the left pushing hard from gay rights to transgenderism to transing the kids, right? This is something that's so shocking that the only explanation is that something demonic is happening. It's outside. It broke outside this sort of plausibility structure for most people, and so it has that effect. You could list other things, but I think these are the externalities of it have been productive in that way. We, don't like all the things that led here, that you had to have these things to get here. But it has, I think these things are what turn people back to more transcendent recognition of reality.
Yeah, I think that's right. All right, guys. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. But Timon, where can people find your article? And do you have anything exciting coming out that you want to make people aware of?
Yeah, so they can find the article at AmericanReformer.org, where most of what I write is, and of course there's other stuff on there as well. I have in the near future a couple books coming out, one with Canon Press called Political Protestantism, and another next year with Passage Press on evangelicals in the age of Trump. So be on the lookout for both of those, and you can follow along on Twitter to get updates and all that. But those are the things on the horizon.
Excellent. All right, guys, we got a few questions of the people, so we'll check over there, but make sure that you are looking for Timon's work as well. Let's see. Mostly Peaceful Merch says Romans 13 is used as a bludgeon when the left is in power and is ignored when the right gets a hint of power.
Yeah, I think I'm assuming they mean by Christians. I don't know if like atheists, leftists are citing Romans 13, but by Christians, right? When the left is in power, they're very good at pursuing substantive goods, a vision of the good, and promoting it throughout society, and also punishing things they believe are evil. So they're good at a moral vision, and the right is bad generally, or has been bad when in power of forwarding a substantive moral vision.
And then Tiny Stupid Demon says, I remember watching JFK's funeral. When J.D. Vance gave his speech at the memorial, I thought, no prior political figure in my lifetime could have possibly given this speech. It was that stunning. Yeah, and JD has really been batting 1,000. We didn't even get to JD's actions yesterday with kind of the Republican group chat and everything that happened there. I'll be speaking with Dave the Distributist tonight about that. You'll see that episode on Friday. But yeah, he's been a fantastic asset for, I think, the administration. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And then Joe McDermott says, we need to ignore people who say we cannot enforce consequences. We can still have compassion and forgiveness, but forgiveness does not forego consequences. Again, this is just, I feel it should be obvious. This is obvious to any parent who isn't terrible at what they do. And of course, the state has a far more severe version of parenthood that they must do for the entire nation. So the idea that they should forego any of these punishments or that there should not be serious consequences, as Timon has pointed out repeatedly here, that is just violence against the innocent, right? This is just abdication of your responsibility and therefore violence against the innocent. The entire structure of our society, the reason that we that we push and work so hard to maintain it, is that we forego this private justice for the public justice and the public good. If you don't have the private justice, then literally the magistrate is there to prevent justice at all, which is the cruelest form at all. This is why we call it a narco tyranny, right? That the magistrate will punish the just and withhold punishment from the unjust. This is the worst form of government, and it is the one that unfortunately many conservatives and Christians sometimes seem to advocate on behalf of.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, obviously. And again, the magistrate is supposed to, you'll see this frequently, especially in Protestant theology, the magistrate has a double image of God. He images God not just as a man, but in his office. And so when you're talking about there's no conflict in God, but when he exercises discipline on us. Right, he's still perfect love, and all of his attributes are perfect and not contradictory. But he still exercises his wrath and retribution and judgment and correction on us. So, insofar as a man can image God in this way, a finite man this side of heaven, the magistrate is supposed to be that.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you, everybody, once again for watching. Make sure that you're checking out Timon's article over at American Reformer. And if it's your first time on this YouTube channel, you need to subscribe, click the bell notifications, all that stuff, so you know when we go live. If you want to get these broadcasts as podcasts, make sure to subscribe to the MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast networks. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And as always, I'll talk to you next time.